In the early 1800s, Britain had a massive problem. They were obsessed with Chinese tea, silk, and porcelain. But the Chinese Emperor Qianlong looked at the British and saw nothing but barbarians. He demanded one thing and one thing only for his goods: silver. This created a brutal trade deficit. Britain's silver was hemorrhaging out of the treasury and into Chinese vaults. It was a slow-motion financial suicide. To survive, the British Empire didn't just need a new product. They needed a weaponized commodity that would force the silver back into their pockets. They needed a way to break the Chinese monopoly and liquidate their wealth. That weapon was opium. Grown in the fields of British-occupied India, opium was the perfect product. It was cheap to produce, highly portable, and most importantly, it created its own demand through biological addiction. But there was a catch. Opium was strictly illegal in China. So, how did the sophisticated British Empire become the world's biggest drug runner? They didn't do it directly. They used a cutout strategy, a classic move used by modern cartels and shadow corporations today. The British East India Company would sell the opium to private merchants in India, who would then smuggle it into China via corrupt local officials and secret coastal depots. This was a mathematical ambush. Within years, the silver that had flowed into China for centuries began to flow back out. The Chinese economy was being cannibalized from the inside out. By 1839, the Chinese government realized they were facing a total system liquidation. Millions were addicted, the army was rotting, and the treasury was empty. A high-ranking official named Lin Zexu was sent to Canton to stop the bleeding. In a bold cinematic move, he seized 20,000 chests of British opium and dumped them into the sea. He thought he was defending his nation's morality. In reality, he was walking right into a British trap. Britain didn't see destroyed drugs. They saw destroyed private property. They used this as the ultimate excuse to launch a full-scale military invasion. This was the birth of gunboat diplomacy. The British Navy, equipped with steam-powered warships and modern artillery, absolutely mutilated the outdated Chinese junk ships. It wasn't even a fight. It was an execution. China was forced to sign the Treaty of Nanking, which is now known as the Unequal Treaty. The terms were brutal. China had to pay for the opium they destroyed, pay for the cost of the war Britain started, and see the island of Hong Kong. But the most lethal part of the deal, they had to open treaty ports where the British could trade whatever they wanted, including more opium. Britain had effectively legalized their own cartel. But here is the twist that history books usually skip. The Opium Wars weren't just about drugs. They were about the birth of the modern global banking system. The massive profits from the opium trade were laundered through new financial institutions in Hong Kong and London. These banks used that blood money to fund the railroads, the telegraphs, and the Industrial Revolution. The very infrastructure of the modern world was built on the back of a manufactured addiction. Britain didn't just win a war. They created a self-sustaining loop of debt and dependency that lasted for over a century. They turned a sovereign nation into a client state by weaponizing a commodity. The lesson for you today is cold and calculated. If you don't control the flow of value, you are the product. The British didn't work harder than the Chinese. They worked smarter by identifying a bottleneck and exploiting a biological vulnerability. In the modern world, opium isn't always a drug. It's attention, it's data, it's consumer debt. Companies today use the same addiction-based models to ensure you keep paying while they keep growing. You are either the one building the system, or you are the one being liquidated by it. Transparency is your only shield. If you understand how these ambushes are set up, you can avoid the trap. The British cartel succeeded because they operated in the shadows of private trade until it was too late for China to react. Today, the game is faster, but the rules are identical. You need to find the silver in your own life and protect it from the modern-day cartels trying to drain your treasury. Don't be the merchant who gets addicted. Be the architect who understands the ledger. Britain's rise to the world's richest empire wasn't an accident of civilization. It was a calculated, predatory maneuver that prioritized profit over millions of lives. It remains history's most successful and most terrifying business model. It proves that with enough firepower and a well-timed financial glitch, you can own the world. To understand how Britain became the world's richest cartel, you have to follow the silver. After the First Opium War, the British didn't just walk away with Hong Kong. They walked away with a blueprint for infinite wealth. But the Chinese weren't going down without a fight. They tried to slow-walk the treaties, blocking trade and resisting the poison that was liquefying their society. The British, ever the predatory opportunists, needed a second glitch to finish the job. In 1856, they found it. A small ship called the Arrow was seized by Chinese officials under suspicion of piracy. It was a minor legal dispute, but for the British, it was the ultimate casus belli, a reason for war. This was the Second Opium War, and this time the British brought France. The French joined the slaughter. eager for their own piece of the Chinese carcass. If the first war was a mugging, the second was a systematic dismantling of a civilization. They marched all the way to Beijing and committed one of the most heartbreaking acts of cultural liquidation in history, the burning of the old summer palace. Imagine a palace so vast it held 800 years of art, gold, and history, reduced to ash in 3 days just to send a message. The message was clear: your culture is worthless. Our ledger is everything. But here is the hidden insight that investors need to burn into their brains. How did the British manage the sheer volume of silver flowing back? They couldn't just keep it in wooden chests. They needed a machine to move it, hide it, and multiply it. Enter the great merchant houses, Jardine Matheson and the Sassoon family. These weren't just traders. They were the original architects of the global shadow bank. David Sassoon, known as the Rothschild of the East, understood a fundamental law of power. If you control the commodity that people must have, you control the people. He expanded the opium monopoly from India to the heart of Shanghai, creating a vertical integration that would make modern tech CEOs blush. These families didn't just sit on their gold. They realized that drug money is only powerful if it becomes institutional money. They took the massive profits from the addiction of 40 million Chinese citizens and funneled it into the London Stock Exchange. They bought up railroads in America, cotton mills in Egypt, and tea plantations in India. This is the step-by-step blueprint of the elite. Identify a biological or psychological bottleneck, addiction/necessity. Execute a predatory arbitrage, buy cheap, sell where it's illegal or scarce. Trigger a state-sponsored defense, use the military to protect private property. Institutionalize the profits, move the money into clean assets like banks and infrastructure. The HSBC Bank, the Hong Kong and Shanghai Banking Corporation, was literally founded in 1865 to handle the local needs of this trade. While the world looked at opium as a tragedy, the bankers looked at it as liquidity. This is the terrifying truth of the global economy. Much of the capital that built the modern civilized West was seeded by the deliberate destruction of the East. The British Empire wasn't just a government. It was a holding company for the world's most aggressive venture capitalists. By the time the trade was finally suppressed in the early 20th century, the damage was done. Britain had successfully pivoted from a drug cartel to a global financial superpower. They no longer needed to sell opium because they now owned the banks that gave the loans to everyone else. They moved from the hustle to the system. So, what is the lesson for the modern investor, the teen learner, and the seeker of truth? First, morality is often a lagging indicator of wealth. The respectable institutions of today were often the predators of yesterday. Second, scarcity is a weapon. The British didn't just sell opium, they control the access to it. In today's world, the opium is your data, your attention, and your social credit. The companies that own the platforms you can't live without are using the exact same psychological hooks David Sassoon used in 1850. They want you addicted to the scroll so they can harvest your silver. The China trap was simple: make the targets so dependent on the product that they will bankrupt themselves to get it. Today, we see this in the cheap debt trap. We see it in the infinite content trap. The mechanics haven't changed, only the delivery system. You are currently living in a world built on the foundations of the opium ambush. Every time you use a global bank or trade a multinational stock, you're interacting with the ghosts of the British cartel. The question isn't whether the game is rigged. It's whether you're smart enough to see the wires. You cannot win a game you don't understand. The British didn't win because they were better. They won because they were the only ones who knew they were in a war. They fought with ledgers while others fought with bows. They understood that in the end, the person who controls the addiction controls the empire. As you look at the modern financial landscape, look for the bottlenecks. Look for the addictions. Look for where the silver is hemorrhaging. Because wherever there is a massacre of value, there is a cartel waiting to harvest the remains. History doesn't repeat, but it absolutely rhymes in the language of money. If you could go back to 1860 with a knowledge of how this ended, would you try to stop the cartel, or would you buy shares in the bank? Does a civilized society ever truly stop being a cartel, or does it just get better at hiding the fingerprints? Comment your most controversial take below. If you want to keep deconstructing the matrix of wealth and power, subscribe to AssetNova.